In this lesson, I want to spend some time talking about the outbreak of the Wars of Roses. This means spending basically all of our time looking at the First Battle of Albans in 1455, in May 1455. We will also finish by looking at the balance of military power in 1455, and we'll just spend a little bit of time looking at that. And we will also talk very, very briefly about the background to the battle itself, because essentially it's all basically already ground that we have covered in the previous two lessons when we looked at the when we looked at the reign of Henry VI, and we looked at his weakness as the reign of Henry VI, and also when we looked at the position of Richard of York within English politics. So, from a political perspective, then, the sort of background to this conflict, or this background specifically to this battle, was characterized by a series of conflicts that we see that are starting to bubble up from beneath the surface between the Lancastrians, the supporters of King Henry VI, and the Yorkist faction that was led by Richard, Duke of York, who he himself had a claim to the throne through being the distant relative of the second son of Edward III, which is why some even argue that he had a greater claim to the throne than Henry VI. Henry VI was a particularly weak ruler. His reign was marked by increasing instability, partially due to his mental illness. He spent the majority of the first part of his reign as a child under the protectorate of various different noble families. This was when he took the throne in 1422, after the unexpected death of his father, Henry V. In 1453, he suffered a mental breakdown, leaving him incapable of ruling. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, initially stepped in to manage royal affairs. However, her leadership was widely criticised, and her decisions were soon seen as damaging the kingdom. And so the king's incapacity, and with Margaret's influence creating a power vacuum, we see that Richard of York, the cousin of the king and heir presumptive, sought to fill this particular role. And so we see the claim of the Richard of York as protectorate, and in 1454, Henry's illness allowed Richard of York to be appointed as protector of the realm. However, the position of protector was always seen as a temporary position, and York's power was very quickly contested and stymied at every single step by Queen Margaret of Anjou, because of course Margaret of Anjou realised and recognised the potentiality of Richard's claim to the throne, and the potentiality that such a claim could actually lead to him taking over. She was concerned then about the fact that if that was the case, then her own son would have no rights to the throne. And so despite his desire, that being Richard's desire for political influence, Richard of York's tenure was very short-lived. And so when Henry then made a recovery in 1455, he resumed control of the monarchy. This was a blow for the House of York and for York himself, who found himself excluded once again from political power. When we then start to think about the exclusion of Richard of York, we see that this grows in terms of frustration as he is sidelined. We see that there are particular grievances, such as the loss of Normandy and the resulting Cage Rebellion, and York's exclusion from the royal court, coupled with the growing resentment of the royal mismanagement, led him to actually challenge Henry VI to the throne. And this gets to the point at which we are looking at the start of 1455, and we start to see the deepening division between the two factions. We see on the one hand the Lancastrian faction led by Margaret and her supporters, and the Yorkist faction led by Richard of York and his allies. Famously, Henry VI was always a peaceful king. He never really wanted to see violence or war break out, and he was seen as a particularly weak king. And it's one of the reasons why the very, very ambitious Margaret of Anjou sought to claim authority for the Lancastrian house in opposition to Richard of York, and the sort of tensions took place while Henry was sort of trying to rule and be king, but ultimately he did not present himself as a key leading figure during this time because, of course, he was a very weak figure. And so the First Battle of Albans was not necessarily the result of a single event, but it was really the culmination of escalating tensions and a number of political manoeuvres. Now, there are several key political factors which contributes to this. The first of which is in early 1455, the conflict we see reaches its tipping point between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. And in response to this, Richard of York sought to get a formal agreement in place to secure his position as potentially heir to the throne. Now, this would then displace the son of Henry VI, who was, of course, Prince Edward. The Acts of Accord of 1455 sought to resolve the conflict then, to resolve any kind of tension, by acknowledging Richard of York as the rightful heir and the rightful successor to the throne. Of course, as you can imagine, given what we know already of Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrians, this was a very deeply unpopular act, and so for Margaret it was unacceptable, and it was an unacceptable challenge to the legitimacy of her son's claim to the throne, because if the Acts of Accord from 1455 had gone through, then it would have been very clear that her son would not have been able to claim the throne himself. The result is that by May 1455, the political situation had then deteriorated into an open conflict. Both sides had begun to mobilise troops. We see that Richard of York had a number of allies, including the Earl of Warwick and the Duke of Norfolk, as well as a few others, and assembled an army to confront the Lancastrians, who were gathering their forces under the leadership of Queen Margaret. The mobilisation of these, both sides, ultimately sees the opposing sides seeking to seize control of important strategic locations. The Yorkists moved towards St Albans, which was a town located just north of London, with the intention of engaging the Lancastrians in battle. The reason why St Albans was an important strategic point is because it was a key market town and located very close to London, giving whoever controlled it access to the capital itself. And so the First Battle of St Albans took place on the 22nd of May 1455, and although it was a relatively small battle in terms of scale compared to later battles of the Wars of the Roses, it's still very significant in terms of its political and its military consequences. It was the first major engagement that would become a prolonged series of events, a prolonged series of civil wars. The forces involved include firstly the Yorkist army that was led by Richard of York, assisted by the Earl of Warwick and the Duke of Norfolk. The exact size of the force is debated, but estimates range between 3,000 to 6,000 men. So, of course, not a huge number of people for battles, but a relatively average for medieval battles at least. But like I said just a second ago, not as many as we will see in terms of the more significant battles towards the ender periods of the Wars of the Roses, and not the most significant battle in all of English history when thinking about size. But it's more the political significance of the Battle of St Albans that is to be spoken about. By contrast, then, the Lancastrians were led by Queen Margaret, who had the support of a number of key Lancastrian lords. These included the Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and the Earl of Westmoreland. Now, the Lancastrians were estimated to have a similar size force to that of the Yorkists, so it was a roughly equal battle, a range from between 3,000 to 6,000, although their numbers are debated and the numbers are relatively uncertain. In terms of the outcome of the battle, we see that this was a decisive victory for the Yorkists. Despite being potentially numerically superior, the Lancastrian forces were outmaneuvered by the Yorkists, who took advantage of their familiarity with the terrain and their effective command structure. So, again, some argue that they were outnumbered, potentially being numerically superior. Others argue that the numbers are uncertain, but estimated to have a similar or slightly larger force. So in terms of medieval battles, having ever so slightly larger force was probably not something that would have been a decisive factor in any kind of victory, as was the case here, when it obviously contributed to, or did not contribute to, their victory, but led to their defeat. In terms of casualties, we can see that the key Lancastrian leaders, like the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Northumberland, were both killed in the fighting, again severely weakening the Lancastrian faction. We also see the capture of King Henry VI by the Yorkists, being a very critical moment in the battle, because it gave Richard of York and his supporters control of the king and effectively neutralised the Lancastrian leadership. And so when we think about the general aftermath, what took place following this, we see that Richard, Duke of York, took control of the king, which allowed him to exercise quite a significant amount of political power. Henry VI was captured, he was not harmed, and the Queen and other Lancastrian leaders fled the field and escaped capture. It did not, however, completely resolve the conflict, because although the Yorkists had won in a decisive victory, Queen Margaret remained determined to fight for her son's inheritance, and then the Lancastrians were not easily going to give up control of the throne. And so this leaves us to the point at which we think about the balance of power militarily in 1455. We can see that the balance of military power had shifted towards the Yorkists in favour. But this was a far from settled situation. The battle was a significant victory for Richard. It allowed him to capture Henry VI and start to assert control of the royal governance. But for a brief period, Richard became the de facto ruler of England and was able to influence royal policies and key decisions. The victory also gave the Yorkists a military advantage because they had secured several nobles and military leaders. The Lancastrian losses, such as the Dukes of Somerset and Northumberland, seriously weakens the Lancastrian cause. But we still see that Margaret of Anjou, Queen Margaret, was determined to, along with a number of other Lancastrian nobles, were all determined to ensure that they keep her son on the throne, or her son in the inheritance at least, and so they were not easily defeated and would regroup for future fighting. While the Yorkists held the initiative after St Albans, they were not able to decisively end the conflict. And so the Lancastrians, despite their losses, retained control over northern parts of England and parts of the West Country, and the military situation was still relatively fluid. And so in terms of long-term consequences, it demonstrated that military force, as well as political manoeuvring, could also determine the control of the Wars of the Roses, which we will get to in more detail in future lessons. But what follows then between the period immediately after the Battle of St Albans is an uneasy peace, and we start to see a period of time in which there's a relative lull in the process of the peace or of the Civil War itself, which then causes a further outbreak later on when we see the renewal of fighting in 1459.